Imagine a man who ruled an empire where the sun never set, a monarch who carried on his shoulders the weight of kingdoms, empires, and continents. Charles I of Spain, also known as Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, was one of the most powerful rulers in history. But behind the crown was a man full of paradoxes, challenges, and secrets. Are you ready to discover the story of the man who shaped the destiny of Europe and the world? Born in 1500, Charles inherited one of the greatest empires in history. The son of Joanna the Mad and Philip the Handsome, he ruled over Spain, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, and vast territories in the Americas. His reign was marked by wars, religious reforms, and the expansion of the Spanish Empire. But who was this man behind the crown? And how did he manage to balance so many responsibilities? Ruling territories that spanned from the Americas to Central Europe wasn't just a matter of power, it was a logistical nightmare. Charles spent his entire reign traveling between his domains, never staying in one place for too long, constantly fighting to keep his fragmented empire together. In an age before telecommunications, his greatest enemy was often distance itself. The decisions Charles made would echo through centuries. The religious divisions he faced during the Protestant Reformation still shape our world today. The gold and silver his conquistadors brought back from the Americas transformed the global economy forever. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of the great empires like this video, subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we journey through the fascinating life of the man who ruled the first truly global empire in human history. When Charles came of age, he found himself the inheritor of not just one kingdom, but a collection of territories that made up the most extensive empire the world had seen since ancient Rome. Imagine awakening one day to discover that you now controlled lands stretching from the gold-filled mountains of Peru to the fertile plains of Hungary, all before your 20th birthday. This vast inheritance wasn't due to military conquest, but rather through a remarkable series of marriages and untimely deaths. The Spanish called it Felix Austria, Happy Austria, referring to the Habsburg family's uncanny ability to expand their territories through marital alliances rather than warfare. Let others wage war, they said. You, Happy Austria, marry. Charles's grandfather, Ferdinand of Aragon, had married Isabella of Castile, uniting the two largest kingdoms of Spain. Their daughter, Joanna, Charles's mother, married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, adding the wealthy Netherlands to the family holdings. Meanwhile, his paternal grandfather, Emperor Maximilian I, secured the Habsburg territories in Central Europe and the prestigious title of Holy Roman Emperor. When death swept through the family in quick succession, the teenage Charles found himself the heir to this impossible collection of kingdoms. In 1516, at just 16 years old, he became King of Spain and its American colonies. Then, in 1519, following the death of his grandfather Maximilian, he won election as Holy Roman Emperor after an expensive campaign that essentially bought the title from the German prince-electors. The election cost him 850,000 florins, a sum so astronomical it would be like spending billions in today's currency. Now, ruling such diverse territories presented challenges that would have broken lesser men. Each region had its own laws, customs, languages, and expectations. The Spanish wanted a king who would live in Spain and respect their traditions. The Germans expected their emperor to defend them against Ottoman invasion. The Dutch cherished their ancient liberties and regional autonomy, and across the Atlantic, vast territories with incredible wealth were being conquered in his name by adventurers he had never even met. To address these challenges, Charles became the most traveled monarch of his age. He was constantly on the move, traveling over 400,000 miles during his reign, enough to circle the earth 16 times. He learned to speak 6 languages to communicate with his subjects: Though contemporaries noted, he spoke all of them with a peculiar Flemish accent that sometimes made him difficult to understand. Did you know that Charles V became the first European monarch to set foot in the Americas? In 1535, he journeyed across the Atlantic to Mexico. While Spanish history books often mention this visit, the truth is more nuanced. Charles never actually reached mainland Mexico, but instead visited Spanish territories in the Caribbean to consolidate control over the New World conquests that were sending unimaginable wealth back to Spain. This little-known fact shows just how seriously he took his responsibility to govern every corner of his global empire, even those separated by vast oceans. Charles's empire truly was one where the sun never set. When night fell on Spain, dawn was already breaking over his American territories. No monarch before him had ever faced the logistical nightmare of governing lands so far-flung that news could take months to travel between them. This wasn't just a king with too many castles. This was a ruler trying to govern multiple continents in an age when the fastest message could only travel as quickly as the winds could push a sailing ship. Behind the imposing portraits and grand imperial titles was a man of fascinating contradictions. Charles V was deeply religious, attending Mass daily and carrying a portable altar on his many journeys. Yet this same devout Catholic was also a shrewd political operator who could set aside religious concerns when necessary, even making alliances with Protestant princes when it served his imperial interests. He once declared, "My cousin Francis and I are in perfect accord. He wants Milan, and so do I." This wry humor revealed a pragmatism that sometimes surprised his contemporaries. Though Charles commanded the loyalty of thousands and could charm foreign dignitaries with his diplomatic skills, he remained fundamentally a lonely figure. Few truly knew the man beneath the elaborate royal garments. Charles preferred the company of his hunting dogs to most courtiers and often retreated into solitude when overwhelmed by the burdens of rule. His personal diaries reveal a man who felt the weight of his responsibilities keenly, writing once that, "God has placed a heavy burden upon my shoulders, and I pray daily for the strength to bear it." Perhaps the most profound influence on Charles's character came from his complex relationship with his mother, Joanna the Mad. When Charles was just 6 years old, his father Philip died suddenly, and his mother's fragile mental state deteriorated dramatically. Joanna refused to part with Philip's coffin, traveling with it across Spain and occasionally opening it to gaze upon her husband's decomposing face. The young Charles witnessed his mother's decline into what contemporaries called madness, though modern historians suggest she likely suffered from severe depression or schizophrenia. The Spanish nobility, concerned about Joanna's mental state, eventually confined her to the royal palace at Tordesillas, where she would remain for nearly 50 years. Though Charles technically ruled jointly with his mother, in practice, he took full control of the government. Throughout his life, he visited Joanna regularly, though their interactions were strained and difficult. Court records note that during these visits the emperor would often bow before his mother, who sometimes failed to recognize him. This early trauma left its mark on Charles. Deeply afraid of inheriting his mother's condition, he became increasingly preoccupied with his mental health as he aged. His advisors noted his periods of melancholy, during which he would withdraw from public life entirely. One courtier wrote, "The emperor has fallen into a deep sadness from which no entertainment or company seems to rouse him." These episodes grew more frequent in his later years, contributing to his eventual decision to abdicate. Despite projecting strength to the world, Charles's private letters reveal a man plagued by self-doubt. He questioned whether he was truly fit to rule, writing to his confessor, "I wonder daily if God has chosen the right vessel for such mighty tasks." When faced with the Protestant challenge to Catholic unity, he agonized over whether he had failed in his sacred duty to protect the faith. After the Diet of Augsburg failed to reconcile religious differences in 1530, Charles was seen weeping alone in his chamber, a rare display of emotion from the usually composed emperor. Charles also struggled with his identity throughout his life. Born in Ghent in the Netherlands, raised speaking French and Dutch, yet destined to rule Spain and the German lands, he never fully belonged anywhere. When he first arrived in Spain, the locals mocked his inability to speak Spanish and his foreign mannerisms. "I am neither fully Spanish nor German nor Flemish," he once confided to his sister Mary, "but a stranger everywhere, even in my own lands." His physical appearance added to his insecurities. The famous Habsburg jaw, a hereditary facial deformity that made it difficult for him to chew properly, became more pronounced as he aged. Court painters were instructed to soften this feature in official portraits, but contemporary accounts describe how Charles often struggled to speak clearly and preferred to eat in private to avoid embarrassment. These very human vulnerabilities make Charles more than just a figure in a history book. They reveal a man wrestling with the enormous expectations placed upon him, trying to fulfill his destiny while battling his own personal demons. Throughout his 39-year reign, Charles V found himself locked in an almost constant state of warfare. His empire was like a massive beast with too many vulnerable flanks. When he turned to defend one border, another would come under attack. The Habsburg motto might have celebrated peaceful expansion through marriage, but Charles spent more time in armor than in ceremonial robes. His most persistent adversary was Francis I of France, who felt literally surrounded by Habsburg territories. Imagine France's predicament: Spanish lands to the south, the Netherlands to the north, and Habsburg territories in Germany and Italy to the east. This encirclement sparked a rivalry that would explode into 5 separate wars during Charles's reign. Their most dramatic confrontation came at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. The French army had invaded northern Italy, threatening Habsburg control of the wealthy Duchy of Milan. Charles's forces, led by Spanish tercios, revolutionary infantry formations that combined pikemen with firearms, delivered a crushing defeat to the French. In an almost unbelievable turn of events, King Francis himself was captured on the battlefield. When the news reached Charles, he refused to hold public celebrations, reportedly saying, "A Christian should not rejoice in victory over another Christian." Despite this show of piety, Charles knew the value of his royal prisoner. He kept Francis captive in Madrid for a year, forcing him to sign the humiliating Treaty of Madrid, which ceded French claims in Italy and Burgundy. However, once freed, Francis promptly declared the treaty void, claiming it was signed under duress, and the wars continued. While Charles battled the French in Western Europe, an even greater threat loomed in the east. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was expanding rapidly, having conquered Belgrade in 1521 and Rhodes the following year. In 1529, Ottoman forces reached the gates of Vienna itself, the heart of Charles's Austrian territories. Though the siege failed due to early winter weather, the Ottoman threat remained a constant concern throughout Charles's reign. At sea, the conflict with the Ottomans was equally intense. The Mediterranean became a battleground where Charles's admiral Andrea Doria fought against the infamous Ottoman corsair Barbarossa. These naval conflicts weren't just about territory. They were about protecting vital trade routes and Christian coastal communities from raids that could carry thousands of people into slavery. The financial cost of these constant wars was staggering. Despite the rivers of silver flowing in from the Americas, Charles's treasury was perpetually empty. He declared bankruptcy 3 times during his reign, in 1527, 1557, and 1559. The Spanish author Frances de Zúñiga described the emperor's finances with biting humor. His Imperial Majesty's credit is so good that no banker in Europe will lend him a ducat without collateral worth 10 times the amount. These financial strains fell heavily on Charles's subjects. In Castile, taxes increased 5-fold during his reign. The prosperous cities of the Netherlands groaned under the burden of special war levies. Even the gold and silver from the Americas wasn't enough. Charles borrowed enormous sums from German banking houses like the Fuggers and the Welsers at ruinous interest rates. The human cost was equally devastating. Endless campaigns drained manpower from farms and workshops across the empire. The Spanish tercios, though victorious, suffered terrible casualties. The sack of Rome in 1527 by Charles's unpaid and mutinous troops shocked all of Christian Europe, despite the emperor's claims that the atrocities occurred against his wishes. Perhaps most costly was the toll these wars took on Charles himself. Contemporary accounts describe how his health deteriorated with each campaign. The man who had once been described as handsome and vigorous in his youth became prematurely aged. By his 40s, he suffered from severe gout that left him unable to sign documents, chronic digestive issues from years of rich campaign food, and the deep melancholy that seemed to plague the Habsburg line. In a private letter to his son Philip, Charles confessed his greatest regret. "I have spent my life in motion, not in contemplation of God's glory as I ought, but in endless conflict with those who should have been my brothers in Christ." So did you know that Charles V was the first European monarch to venture to the Americas? If you're enjoying this video, please like, share and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible historical stories. And tell us in the comments, what do you think was Charles V's greatest challenge? Was it the French, the Ottomans, or perhaps something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts. When Charles V assumed power, he could never have imagined that the greatest challenge to his rule would come not from foreign armies, but from a solitary monk in a small German town. In 1517, while the young Charles was still settling into his new Spanish kingdom, an Augustinian professor named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, igniting a religious firestorm that would forever change the face of Europe. Luther's criticisms of church practices, particularly the sale of indulgences, spread like wildfire across German territories, thanks to the revolutionary new technology of the printing press. What began as an academic debate quickly evolved into a fundamental challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church, and by extension to Charles himself, who saw the defense of Catholicism as his sacred duty. In 1521, Charles summoned Luther to appear before the Imperial Diet, a formal assembly of the Holy Roman Empire in the German city of Worms. This confrontation between the powerful emperor and the defiant monk has become one of history's most dramatic moments. Eyewitnesses described the scene. The hall packed with princes and prelates, the 21-year-old emperor seated on his throne, and Luther, dressed in his simple monk's habit, standing before the assembled power of Europe. When ordered to recant his writings, Luther uttered his famous reply, "Unless I am convinced by scripture and plain reason, my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me." Charles was genuinely shocked by Luther's defiance. Raised in the devoutly Catholic courts of Burgundy and Spain, he could barely comprehend such a challenge to church authority. After Luther's departure from Worms, Charles issued the Edict of Worms, declaring Luther an outlaw and heretic and banning his writings throughout the empire. "A single monk," Charles reportedly said, guided by his own private judgment, has set himself against the faith held by all Christians for 1,000 years. But Charles soon discovered that imperial edicts were one thing and enforcement quite another. Many German princes sheltered Luther and embraced his ideas, seeing in the Reformation both religious conviction and a convenient way to assert their independence from imperial control. Frederick the Wise of Saxony secretly arranged for Luther's protection, hiding him in Wartburg Castle, where the reformer translated the New Testament into German, making scripture accessible to common people for the first time. What Charles failed to grasp initially was that the Reformation wasn't just a theological dispute, it was also deeply political. For centuries, German princes had chafed under imperial authority. Luther's defiance gave them theological justification for political resistance. When Charles demanded they suppress Protestant preaching in their territories, many refused outright. The situation grew even more complicated when Luther's ideas spread beyond Germany. Soon, different versions of Protestant thought emerged across Europe. Zwinglians in Switzerland, Calvinists in Geneva, and various Anabaptist groups throughout Central Europe. Charles found himself facing not one religious challenge, but many, each with its own theology and political implications. By 1529, the division had become formalized. A group of Lutheran princes issued the protestation at Speyer, rejecting Charles's attempt to enforce Catholic orthodoxy, giving us the term Protestant. The following year, these princes presented their confession of faith at the Diet of Augsburg, making it clear the religious split was permanent. Charles's response oscillated between attempts at reconciliation and military force. He genuinely believed in the possibility of healing the religious divide and sponsored several conferences where Catholic and Protestant theologians tried to find common ground. The most famous of these, the Colloquy of Regensburg in 1541, came tantalizingly close to agreement on some issues, but ultimately failed. When diplomacy failed, Charles turned to military action. In 1546, he launched the Schmalkaldic War against the Protestant princes, achieving a decisive victory at the Battle of Mühlberg. A famous painting shows Charles riding victorious on the battlefield, but this triumph proved short-lived. Soon the Protestant princes regrouped, now allied with Charles's old enemy, the King of France. In 1555, exhausted by decades of religious conflict, Charles accepted the Peace of Augsburg, which established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio. The ruler of each territory would determine its religion, and subjects who disagreed could emigrate. It was a pragmatic solution that Charles had once considered unthinkable, a formal recognition that the unified Christian Europe of his dreams was gone forever. The religious crisis took a personal toll on Charles. His diary entries from this period reveal a man tormented by what he perceived as his failure to maintain religious unity. "God placed me in this office to defend his church," he wrote, "and yet I have lived to see it torn asunder." Court observers noted that news of Protestant advances would often trigger his bouts of depression. In a twist of historical irony, the gold and silver from the Americas that funded Charles's wars against the Protestants also fueled the spread of Protestantism. His constant need for German troops and loans from German bankers limited his ability to suppress the Reformation in German lands. As one Spanish advisor bitterly remarked, "His Majesty conquers the New World only to lose the Old." On a cold October day in 1555, the Great Hall of the Palace of Brussels fell silent as Emperor Charles V, leaning heavily on the shoulder of a young prince, slowly made his way to the throne. Just 55 years old, he appeared decades older. His hair had turned grey, his Habsburg jaw more pronounced than ever, and gout had so crippled him that each step was agony. The assembled nobles watched in stunned silence as the man who had ruled half the world prepared to surrender it all voluntarily. In a voice trembling with emotion, Charles addressed the gathered dignitaries. "I have given you my youth, my mind, my strength. Now I give you my crown." With these words, he began an unprecedented series of abdications that would dismantle the greatest empire Europe had seen since Roman times. Charles's decision to abdicate shocked the royal courts of Europe. Monarchs simply didn't retire in the 16th century. They ruled until death. But Charles had been contemplating this move for years, confiding to his sister Mary as early as 1542 that he dreamed of laying down these burdens before they lay me down in my grave. The carefully orchestrated transfer of power took place in stages. Charles first resigned the Netherlands to his son Philip, then the crowns of Spain, Sicily, and the Americas. Finally, in 1556, he surrendered the title of Holy Roman Emperor to his brother Ferdinand. The great Habsburg inheritance, assembled through generations of strategic marriages, was now divided. Ferdinand would rule the Austrian territories and the Holy Roman Empire, while Philip inherited Spain, the Netherlands, and the vast colonial possessions in the Americas. This division had profound implications for European history. The Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family would now pursue separate, sometimes competing interests. The dream of a unified Catholic empire stretching across Europe was abandoned. As Charles reportedly told his son, "I have tried to grasp too much. You must learn to grasp less firmly, but hold it longer." After divesting himself of power, Charles embarked on his final journey, not to some grand palace, but to the remote monastery of Yuste in the mountains of Extremadura, Spain. The once mighty emperor, who had commanded armies and ruled continents, now occupied a simple six-room dwelling attached to the monastery. His residence was modest by royal standards, though he did bring a small retinue of about 50 servants and his beloved collection of timepieces. At Yuste, Charles lived a life that balanced monastic simplicity with imperial habits. He attended daily masses, but also enjoyed elaborate meals that defied his doctor's orders. He spent hours in prayer and contemplation, but remained keenly interested in world affairs, receiving regular dispatches about his son's reign and offering unsolicited advice. One of the most curious aspects of Charles's retirement was his obsession with clocks and watches. His rooms at Yuste were filled with dozens of timepieces, ticking and chiming at all hours. When his attendants complained about the noise, Charles reportedly quipped, "If I have disturbed the peace of so many realms in my lifetime, surely I may be allowed to disturb a few clocks in my retirement." Legend even claims that one of Charles's greatest frustrations at Yuste was his failed attempt to synchronize his collection of clocks, perhaps a metaphor for his lifelong struggle to bring harmony to his diverse realms. In a macabre twist that revealed his melancholy nature, Charles arranged a mock funeral for himself, lying in a coffin while funeral rites were performed around him. Less than a year after this strange rehearsal, on September 21st, 1558, Charles died clutching a crucifix that had once belonged to his wife Isabella, who had died 22 years earlier. His final words were reported to be, "Jesus," a fitting end for a man who had seen himself as Catholicism's greatest defender. What legacy did this extraordinary ruler leave behind? In the short term, his division of the Habsburg inheritance shaped European politics for centuries. The Spanish Habsburg line would continue until 1700, while the Austrian branch would rule until 1918. The religious compromise he reluctantly accepted at Augsburg established a precedent for religious coexistence that, though imperfect, helped Europe begin to move beyond the era of religious wars. Economically, Charles's reign witnessed the beginning of truly global commerce. The silver from the Americas that flowed into Spain transformed the European economy, ultimately leading to price revolutions and new financial systems. Spanish became a global language spoken across vast territories in the Americas, establishing cultural connections that endure to this day. Perhaps most significantly, Charles represented the end of an era and the beginning of another. He was the last emperor to dream of a universal Christian monarchy in the medieval tradition, yet he ruled during the birth of the modern state system. His pragmatic acceptance of Europe's religious and political diversity helped set the stage for the modern international order, based on sovereign states rather than universal empire. In the centuries since his death, Charles has been viewed differently by various nations. To Spaniards, he is Carlos I, the emperor who made Spain the center of a global empire. To Germans, he is Karl V, the ruler who failed to prevent the religious fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. To Belgians and Dutch, he is Karel, the native son who understood their commercial interests before Spanish priorities took precedence. This multifaceted legacy reflects the complexity of the man himself, a ruler of many kingdoms who never felt fully at home in any of them, a defender of Catholic unity who presided over its fracturing, a warrior who ultimately sought peace in monastic seclusion. Charles V's remarkable life bridges the medieval and modern worlds, making him not just a figure of the past, but a key to understanding how our present world came to be. Charles I of Spain, or Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, was a man who carried the weight of an empire where the sun never set. His extraordinary life spanned a pivotal moment in world history, when medieval certainties were giving way to modern complexities, when the discovery of new worlds was transforming the old, when the unity of faith was shattering into competing visions. Few rulers in history have faced such diverse challenges. From the battlefields of Italy to the council chambers of Germany, from the gold-filled ships returning from the Americas to the siege lines around Vienna, Charles navigated a world that was changing more rapidly than any emperor before him had witnessed. His achievements were remarkable. He consolidated Spanish power in Europe and the Americas, defended Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, and preserved Habsburg influence for centuries to come. Yet his failures were equally significant. The permanent religious division of Europe, the bankruptcies that undermined Spanish power, and the exhaustion of resources that would eventually lead to Spain's decline. In the end, the man who could command armies across continents chose a path that would have seemed unimaginable to his younger self. By retreating to the monastery at Yuste, Charles made perhaps his most human statement, that even for the most powerful ruler in the world, there comes a time to set aside ambition and power in search of something more profound. Did Charles find the peace he sought in those quiet mountains of Extremadura? His letters from this period suggest a man still troubled by worldly concerns, still wrestling with the consequences of his decisions, still prone to melancholy. Yet they also reveal moments of genuine contentment, in simple pleasures, in quiet contemplation, in the freedom from the crushing responsibilities he had carried for nearly 4 decades. Perhaps the most telling insight comes from his final instructions for his burial. Unlike his ancestors, who commissioned grand tombs and elaborate monuments, Charles requested a simple ceremony and a plain slate slab. The emperor, who had once claimed dominion over half the known world, ultimately embraced humility as his final statement. In many ways, Charles's life embodies the contradictions of his age. The striving for universal authority, alongside the emergence of distinct national identities, the devotion to traditional faith alongside new religious expressions, the wielding of absolute power alongside growing doubts about its limits. His story is not just a chronicle of one man's reign, but a window into a world in transition. As we look back on Charles's extraordinary life, we're reminded that even the mightiest figures in history were, in the end, human beings, facing choices, making mistakes, experiencing triumphs and disappointments, and sometimes finding wisdom in surrender rather than conquest. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of history's most fascinating rulers, please hit that like button, share this video with friends who love history, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more content about the transformative figures and events of the modern era. Which historical ruler would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below. Until our next historical journey together.